Very exciting to have this meeting. Hopefully we're taking the study of war to a new level of constructive interest rather than just debating about whether or not war actually happens. I want to make a special point of thanking Mike and Luke, who I've collaborated with to my enormous advantage with chimpanzees and humans. Okay, so here's the roadmap. We're going to talk a little bit about what chimpanzees do. Mike will be talking more about it on Friday. I want to draw attention to this notion of coalitional impunity, which is my phrase for, I'll explain it later. Then thinking about why it is worth thinking about chimpanzees for understanding anarchic warfare among hunters and gatherers, and then a couple of problems that arise out of this perspective. So if we look at social groups of animals, then what we find is that the great majority of them have battles that are non-lethal in which they are competing for territory, and in general it looks as though that competition leads to fitness gains for the winners who are able to extend their territory. And then there are just a few species in which we have lethal attacks, in which there are interactions regularly leading to deaths by the victim side. I just want to then take us into the chimpanzee side. So here we have the short version of chimpanzee life. NIMBioS studies in Western Uganda show up to 200 individuals in a community occupying these relatively large territories, temporary subgroups, which are, I'm not going to talk about it, but the factors affecting the size of the subgroup seem to be real constraints at times. That is to say, when periods of certain types of food availability occur, then individuals are forced to travel alone. And males, of course, are more gregarious and sociable than females, so they both are in larger parties and they invest in each other socially through grooming and other methods. Okay, so here we are in Gombe, where these things were discovered, and up here at the top right we have a small party of males who are going through their environment, and they end up on this particular day looking around themselves as they get towards the end of the edge of their territory. And here's the critical thing: they go up to a tree and they climb into it, and it is not a feeding tree. They very rarely climb into trees that are not feeding trees, except to maybe make a bed and sleep. But here what they're doing is climbing up and looking out. They're looking outwards to the neighboring territory. And here's what they're looking for. And they might be seeing it or they might be hearing it. And if they judge it right, apparently, then they will sneak forward and attack. So that was very dramatic, the discovery of the inter-community interactions. A lot of people said, well, there's just something peculiar about this particular site. And then Mike pulled together information from all of the chimpanzee long-term sites last year and showed that there's certainly a lot of variation in the rate at which these killings occur, but nevertheless they are very widespread in the different sites. And showed that the majority of the killings occur in between-group contexts, and that they apply to both infants and, importantly, to adults, and that males are the more common victims than females. One of the concerns had been that this was nothing to do with natural selection, that somehow humans had affected this in peculiar ways, and that paper established that there was no relationship between any measure that could be found of human impact and the rate of killing. On the other hand, there was evidence that the rate of killing was related to biologically relevant factors, the number of males in the aggressive group and the population density as an indication of the importance of competition. So then what's the significance of this? Well, we have a couple of studies which provide evidence in the direction that we would fully expect. Here is the one from Ngogo, which showed that 21 kills made by the study community in the border areas ended up with occupation of a significant chunk of land. So it looks like one kill adds about 1% of territory. And is it important to add a bit of territory? The data from Gombe indicate that it is, because if you look at territory size, then you find that when territories are relatively large, then it's not just that the interbirth interval declines, but it declines really quite markedly. So it's gone from 6 years for a small territory to 4 years for a larger territory. Very significant fitness gains, and matched by data indicating that the chimpanzees are indeed getting more food because they have higher body mass. So how is it that this system of killing works in chimpanzees? Well, Mike did experiments in which he played back calls of strangers to chimps and showed that the number of males in the party is a good predictor of their confidence in approaching the speaker. So they're sensitive to the number in the coalition at the time. And then if we look at the number of individuals in the well-observed attacks where it is possible to see the number of individuals on both sides, then we see this enormous difference in the numbers in the occasions when they attack. So that the median ratio of attackers to defenders is 8 to 1, and in actuality you have about 11 more in the attacking group than you do in the defending group. So here we have the massive imbalance of power that is responsible for the astonishing fact that here you have an animal that is 3 or 4 times as strong as a human, that is fighting for its life, and that in all of the cases that have been observed so far, we have no indication of any of the attackers being seriously hurt. So it's just extraordinary testimony to the fact that there is a very effective system for imposing these kills in a very low-cost way. So that all leads to the imbalance of power hypothesis, which is that because you have a system of territorial defense in which territories matter, and because you have unpredictable associations of sometimes a large group meeting a small party, then you have the opportunity for these low-cost aggression. I'm calling this coalitional impunity as a sufficient imbalance of power that one party can attack the other with impunity. So this changes the way we ordinarily think about aggression. Because ordinarily with aggression we think about 2 opponents who are reasonably well matched, and here we're seeing opponents that are not well matched. And the significance of the evolutionary aspect is that you do not need an immediate stimulus to competition. All you need is long-term advantages from being able to carry out these kills. Okay, so that's the background of the chimpanzee war. I want to just push the notion that once we start appreciating the fact that aggression can take this odd form of being very low cost and having very high predictability of killing, then a couple of things emerge. So the first I want to say is that it favors proactive aggression, the fact of confidence in your ability to win, because of the low cost for aggressors particularly. So in psychology, in psychiatry, there's been for a number of years, back to 1930s, people thinking about the difference between these 2 types of aggression, reactive and proactive. Reactive is a type that we're much more familiar with in many ways, impulsive, affective, hostile aggression in which somebody is aroused. This is the classic source of murder in America. It's 2 people getting into a fight in a bar, and the killing happens in the parking lot outside. That's statistically the most common type of murder. Versus proactive, in which it's planned, it's cold, and it serves to achieve a particular goal. So what is interesting is that work on cats and rats and some in humans indicates that there are distinct neurobiological bases to these 2 types of aggression. In other words, they can be subject to different selection pressures and different evolutionary histories. I think we see that in different animals. So the hypothalamus, the periaqueductal grey, the amygdala are engaged in different ways. And in humans, Adrian Rain has shown that there's some difference. The reactive murderers have relatively low prefrontal cortex activity, unlike the proactive murderers who have average or high activity. And when we think about war, the proactive form of aggression is clearly much more relevant, because the majority of interactions in particularly anarchic small-scale war, which I think we're talking about mostly here today, involves raids, surprise attacks. And I think you can make a case that that is actually the case even with modern war, that most modern war involves a series of exchanges of raids. So that we should be thinking about proactive rather than reactive aggression. I want to draw attention to this because my old advisor, Robert Hind, he always hated the idea there was anything biological about war. And the reason ultimately was because he kept coming back to the notion that reactive aggression is not important in war. And reactive aggression seemed to be the only kind of aggression that was important biologically. So I think it's really worth drawing attention to the fact that we have models for animals with both kinds of aggression. And note that reactive aggression is the type that you read about in textbooks of animal behavior, whatever it is, and it dominates, here a quote, much of the understanding in terms of humans, whereas I think we can make an argument that the most of the killing that occurs is actually through proactive aggression. So we want to separate these two types and think about them separately. You need both, I would argue, to understand why it is that some species have got what I'm calling in quotes here a foreign policy that is proactively aggressive, in quotes, because I understand chimps don't really have a policy, but that is the way that their behavior appears to manifest itself. And the important point about this is that all social primates have intergroup competition. But because most of them don't have an evolutionary history of coalitional impunity, that means they don't end up trying to attack each other. But humans do. So that's one point that emerges. And the second point is about the significance of coalitional impunity for coercive power. So the situation is that victory is predictable, as long as you can organize your coalition appropriately, very low cost. And so that means that when the victim encounters a coalition like that, then it's adaptive to them to submit and be coerced. And it's a consequence in humans, the ability to coerce is a consequence of this coalitional impunity. So the dominants can coerce cheaply, and then you get, I think, a stable distribution of coercive power depending on how stable the coalitional system can be. And so here are some examples I want to suggest of this. Why is it that men are dominant as a cultural grouping to women in, all societies? And the answer ultimately is that the male elders are able to organize, ultimately, capital punishment, death. And I think you can argue that in all these cases, the ability of hunters and gatherers to impose capital punishment on some guy who tries to be too assertive within the group, as Boehm and Otterbein and others have argued, leads to the male reverse dominance hierarchy. The ability of tyrants to maintain power and the whole basis of law is ultimately coalitional impunity. I suppose I'm taking too strong a line here, but I want to say that it's a tremendously important contributor to it. Here's Krober saying what I've been trying to say. Okay, so what's the significance of the chimpanzees as a model for hunters and gatherers? Well, I think this is the big point. We have the chimps moving to the edge of the boundary. If they detect the possibility that there's a lone victim, enthusiastically moving forwards. And everyone has said, well, what's the reward? And proving a negative is very difficult. But at the moment, there is no indication that the females enthusiastically say, hey, you defended our territory, let's do it. There is no indication that any kind of shift to the dominance interactions and dominance relationships occurs as a consequence. There is no indication of social favors, and there's no indication that somebody who doesn't go gets punished. So maybe we're wrong. Maybe Mike has data that I don't know about that's going to undermine us. But at the moment, it seems that this is occurring without any kind of the sorts of rewards or punishment that we as humans would have expected to generate the behavior. So the similarities between hunter-gatherer and chimpanzee war, there's obvious possibilities that the imbalance of power hypothesis that seems to apply to chimpanzees can be applied to hunters and gatherers. And so I just want to look at this now, the notion that just as in chimpanzees, what natural selection has done is to favor a propensity for unprovoked attack against strangers. Then the same thing has happened in humans. So hunter-gatherer society, the way I'm thinking about this is that we're talking about the ethnolinguistic groups. We're not talking about the bands. So the society is the few hundred or several thousand individuals who share a common language and common culture. And within that, you do have at one level fission fusion of camps, bands, and then at another level fission fusion of people going out and foraging by day. And those are the ones that very often can encounter members of neighboring societies. And as in chimps, the men travel further than the women. Okay, so as we try and apply this, we got to think about this kind of challenge from Doug Fry, that there's a lot of people at the hunter-gatherer level of organization that just don't have war. But the problem with that phrase is the word ancestral, because ancestral should mean hunters and gatherers living with other hunters and gatherers as neighbors, because once they have farmers, pastoralists as neighbors, then strategic considerations mean that they should recognize the dominant power. So if you look at just those hunters and gatherers living in world systems, in other words, where you have hunters and gatherers as neighbors, and even this is, the data is not as wonderful as one would like, but nevertheless what Luke and I did was to review those and find that you get very consistent descriptions of shooting on sight. That is to say, the stranger is encountered and the immediate response is not to offer them a cup of tea, but to try and kill them. The pattern of war is principally through ambushes and raids, and the overt fear of strangers. And taking the compilation by Lawrence Keeley from 1996 and adding just a few, we see that hunter-gatherer warfare has this similarity to chimpanzees, that it's in the same order of magnitude of the deaths per year. So these make it seem rather similar to the chimpanzee situation. And that is, to me, the value of thinking about chimpanzees versus hunters and gatherers. That we've got these war traits shared with chimpanzees, high death rate, shooting on sight, cooperating males, and proactively attacking without any need to invoke rewards, punishment, group selection, weapons, or language, because they don't apply to chimps, so why should they apply to humans? Maybe they do apply to humans, maybe they change the dynamic in some way, but they're not necessary. So that's a sort of primatological starting point. There are problems that arise. I'm not suggesting that we have solved everything at all. One is that it is clear that unlike the 0 for 87 or whatever it is, cases of chimpanzees getting wounded in hunter-gatherer life, people do get wounded. Not always. This isn't hunters and gatherers, but it is small-scale society. And Beckerman recorded 551 deaths, and in all of those being killed, according to the recollections of the killers, there was not a single case of any of the killers being seriously injured. But nevertheless, it does happen sometimes. And that is because sometimes the defenders who are being attacked get word of what's about to happen, or for various reasons they're able to turn the tables. So given that, then one might think that humans should be much less aggressive, because the whole point is that there should be very low cost to the aggressors, and here we're seeing there is evidence of some cost. So what is happening there? And one possibility that has been advocated by Darwin and later by Sam Bowles and many others is that those who are willing to take some kind of risk are members of groups in which their genes are able eventually to be passed on, so that if there's sufficient genetic differentiation between groups, group selection can favor what Bowles calls parochial altruism, which I'm thinking of as the risk-taking. That's been challenged by the fact that in chimpanzees you actually have very similar conditions to those applying to humans. The same degree of between-group genetic differences and the same rate of between-group killing. So again, why should this argument apply to humans and not to chimps? For that sort of reason and others, Luke and I have taken an alternative tack, which is to say that one of the advantages of a cultural system that humans have and chimps don't have is that they are able to organize a system of rewards, and it's clear that rewards and punishment both have their role in promotion of reducing risk-taking. So here what you see is that by taking the societies that had been previously listed as having known death rates and looking at the number of ethnographically recorded rewards, you see a positive relationship of the type that certainly would make intuitive sense. So one possibility is this contributes to the difference between humans and chimps, that once you have culture, then rewards and punishments start modulating the willingness to take risks. And the second problem is one that I'm sure is going to entertain us here quite a bit, and that is that we do not understand from a behavioral perspective what it is that means that when chimpanzees go on a border patrol, each one is thinking to himself, well, gosh, there's 9 of them, and why do they need the 10th? I'll just go back and carry on eating rather than wasting energy going out and killing. So the collective action problem is why there isn't just a permanent tendency for individuals to defect. And it's a particularly interesting problem since some of them do, in a sense, defect, because there is an indication that lower-ranking individuals are less likely to go to the border areas. And we know that they don't have some sort of automatic sense of wanting to confront the strangers, because they're very sensitive about the conditions under which they should do so. They do not do it if there are several individuals facing them. In fact, when that happens, you get very dramatic interactions in which a group of 5 or 6 chimps is separated by maybe the distance of this room from a facing group, and some will charge forward briefly and then come back again looking for coalition. 2 or 3 of them will go together, come back again. They're very, very ambivalent about enforcing that attack. So, but they're not at the time of going on the border patrols, in the sense that many of the high-ranking individuals are thoroughly enthusiastic about going. So there's 2 levels at which the defection problem works behaviorally. You know, one is, do you join the patrol and stay with it? And the other is, when the patrol is about to do the attack, do you go in there and try and grab a hand or sit on the victim? And at both levels, it's striking that they have somehow solved this problem. So how does selection solve the collective action problem? I believe Sergey is going to talk about that. Thank you.
We now have about 5 minutes for questions, so if any of you have questions, just raise your hand and I can bring the mic to you. Okay, got a couple mics.
Mike, that's a...
Thank you. That was fascinating. My name's Barbara Walter. I'm a political scientist and I study war. And one of the big debates that people like me have had over the years is whether war is more likely to occur when there's a balance of power and imbalance of power. So when you said that these types of attacks happen when victory is predictable, that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Why would you start a war if you're not fairly certain that you're going to win? But it does happen all the time amongst humans. So where there's an enormous amount of uncertainty at the start of the war and the outcome is unpredictable. So why do you think that happens?
Well, I mean, you're immediately taking me out of my comfort zone because you're moving to state war, right, to national war. And here, unlike the kind of level we're talking about, you have leaders. And so once you've got leaders who can make decisions on behalf of others, then it seems to me a different kind of psychology comes in, because so much has changed at that point. The leader isn't necessarily going to be actually fighting themselves. They have all of these people that they can sacrifice at perhaps very low political cost to themselves, or perhaps higher. But the observation I would make about the uncertainty, though, takes us into a different realm. When two animals confront each other in reactive aggression, then in many different species, what you see is that they will escalate their level of investment in the aggressive episode and continue until they fight quite intensely, and one or both of them might be wounded. And one way to think about what's happening there is that they both believe they can win, and that explains why they stay in the interaction longer than you might expect they should. And that natural selection favors a belief in winning, because unless you have a belief in winning, you're never going to win. So that in a relatively balanced interaction, you become self-deceptive. You develop a positive illusion. And Norman Davis, the military psychologist, wrote a book about what he called military incompetence, in which this was a key feature, because he showed that as leaders approach an interaction in which they are opposing each other, then they are increasingly convinced that they are going to win. So that the leaders develop this perception that the reports about the number of tanks on the other side were false, and actually they have fewer tanks than we do, etc. So spy reports get accepted or rejected according to whether or not they fit this perception. So in other words, once you have leaders, then part of the uncertainty would seem to me to be the kind of uncertainty that is involved in one-on-one interactions among animals involved in reactive aggression. An uncertainty that is promoted by natural selection pushing positive illusions.
Well, I wish that I had an entire 35 minutes to react to this, because, you know, you and I usually agree on an awful lot of things, and I think that what I'm going to suggest here is that you're right, but you're only partially right, and I wonder how much you're prepared to entertain that in hunter-gatherer warfare there's some pretty big significant differences that imply that coalitional impunity, while often being important, is not the be-all and end-all of what's driving human calculated aggression and that perhaps we can learn more looking at social insects and some of the things they do. So let me just give two really quick anecdotes that I think, and I could give more, but I think these kinds of things are going to lead us into thinking why it might be that cooperative breeding systems where you might have lineage-based selection for aggression can lead to essentially suicidal risk-taking even in hunter-gatherers. So in my interviews with Aceh and Machigenga, in both groups I ran into cases of specific raids that I was interviewing about where an individual volunteered to stay behind as a counter-raid was being mounted. So, and in one case, superior numbers with superior arms following up on a raiding group, and individuals stopping and staying behind on the trail to defend while the rest fled. In one case, the individual who did that survived, but it was essentially almost suicidal risk-taking. And in the case of the Machigenga, Shumardapagi actually died doing that. Those kinds of things I don't think you'll ever see examples of in chimps, and suggest that there's something a little bit different about planned aggression in humans than just coalitional impunity and the chimp example.
Well, I mean, that's okay, and that I'll subsume, you know, what you said into the point about, okay, so humans take more risks, and we need to understand why. And I'm leaving it as an unsolved problem. I just put up two aspects, but yes, I'm sure that there's more to say about that.